Hi everyone, welcome to our week 4 lecture on expected values. This lecture, we're going to show you how to calculate expected values of a gamble and what they are. And this is going to give us the foundation for how to operationalize beliefs in terms of the expected value of a gamble. Let's get started. Remember that we saw last time that one, but not the only way of justifying beliefs is by operationalizing degrees of belief with betting behavior. And then the strategy that we're going to see is that if we do that, then the correct way or the correct beliefs you should have are beliefs that are going to correspond to probability theory. And that the way you should update those beliefs is by what's called conditionalization. Basically, it means that we're going to use Bayes' rule to update our beliefs. Now, why are we allowed to do this? Why are we allowed to operationalize beliefs as betting behavior? Well, remember that I told you that in science, or especially in the social sciences, we're almost never actually measuring the actual thing we're trying to talk about, right? If we're trying to measure a social phenomenon, you can get that in many ways. You can measure people's physiological responses to things, you can measure their responses to questionnaires, etc. There's many ways to measure a social concept, if you will. And as we'll see, this is a pretty intuitive way of operationalizing degrees of belief. Just to give you one of many, many examples, if you want to measure the health of the economy, there's many things you can measure. You can measure the GDP, you can measure the job rates in the country, you could even measure people's happiness, you could measure how many people migrate into the country or emigrate. You see, there's many ways to operationalizing a concept, such as, let's say, the health of an economy. And so this is what we're going to do with beliefs. We're going to operationalize it as the amount you would be willing to bet on a particular proposition. So to do that, let's look at the expected value of a gamble. One way to measure the attractiveness of a gamble is to look at its expected value. So for example, suppose I propose you the following bet. I toss a coin, you know it's a fair coin, right? I just got it from the grocery store, I did nothing funny with it. If the coin is heads, then I'll give you $1. If the coin is tails, then you give me $1. That's the bet I propose to you. Now, intuitively, how much money can you expect from taking this bet 10 times? Right? If you and me agree to do this bet and we flip the coin 10 times, how much money, if you're not being overly optimistic or pessimistic, do you think you're going to make? Well, maybe your intuition is that you would make $0, right? Because I did nothing funky with the coin. So there's a 50% chance that it lands heads and 50% chance that it lands tails. And so you kind of expect it to land heads 5 times and tails 5 times. And if that happens, we're just going to be giving our dollar back and forth to each other. But of course, that's not how probabilities happen. There is a chance that if we flip it, it lands on heads 10 times. It's just unlikely. But we kind of expect it to be 0. And this is what the expected values are going to allow us to measure. Now, just to get intuitions pumping again, suppose that I propose you a different bet this time. Now, if it's heads, I give you $10, but if it's tails, then you give me $1. Okay, so in this bet, how much money do you expect to make? Well, it might be hard to calculate this, but you might think, well, this is a much better bet than before. You might make quite a bit of money, right? So as we're changing the values of this bet, then it's starting to become harder to assign a particular value, right? Before it was kind of easy to say, well, I expect to make no money. Here it's like, well, I expect to make some money. And what the expected value measures is the average winnings you'll make from a bet. It doesn't measure the winnings you're actually making for the bet, but it'll measure the average winnings. So how should we calculate the expected value? How should we calculate this average? So first, we list all the possible outcomes along with the probabilities and the amount won in each case. Losses in these cases are negative. For each outcome, we're going to multiply the probability by the amount won or lost. And then we're going to add all these products for the final expected value. So, as a lot of things in this class, it usually helps to look at an example. So let's look at the example of kind of the fair bet, or like the okay bet that I proposed to you at the beginning. So suppose I will toss a fair coin. If it's heads, then I give you $1, and if it's tails, you give me $1. Let's write all the tables of the things we have to do to figure out the expected value. So I made it easy for you, and I just put all the tables here. So what are the possible outcomes? Okay, let's start with that table. The possible outcomes of flipping a coin are 2, right? It's heads and tails. Next, we have to look at the probabilities of each outcome. What are the probabilities of these outcomes? Well, we said that they're half and half, right? It wouldn't have to be like that. It could be that it's not a fair coin and they would have a higher probability for heads and a lower probability for tails. But I told you that it's a fair coin, so it's half and half. Now what about the amount won? Well, we saw that if it's heads, then I give you $1. So that's what we're going to put in the first row. We're going to say it's $1. And if it's tails, then you give me $1. So in this case, you lose $1. And so we put 1 in the first row and negative 1 in the second row. And now comes maybe the tricky part. It's where we take the probability and we multiply it by the amount won. So if we do that, we get 0.5 in the first row, right? It's 1 times 1/2, and we get minus 0.5 in the second row, right? It's minus 1 times 1/2. And what we do is we sum up all of these in the last column, and we get a sum of 0. So note that this sum is the expected value. And it kind of corresponds to our intuition of saying, well, in this bet, you kind of expect to make no money. So the average winnings you're going to make on this bet are going to be 0. Okay, so how about the case where I told you, well, if it lands heads, then I'll give you $10, and if it's tails, you give me $1. That already intuitively sounds like a better bet. And what the expected value is going to allow us to do is to see how much better of a bet it is. It's going to give us a measure of how good a bet is. So let's get started. So again, we have the same 2 possible outcomes, heads or tails, and the probabilities are also going to be the same, right? It's the same kind of coin. I didn't do anything funny with it. Now the amount won is going to change. So how much money do you expect to win if it lands heads? We expect to win $10, right? And how much money do you expect to lose if it lands tails? Then you expect to lose $1. Now note that this is from your perspective. If I was doing it from my perspective, then the amount won, if it lands heads, would be minus 10, and the amount won, if it landed tails, would be 1. But this is from your perspective, so you expect to win $10 if it lands heads, and minus $1 if it lands tails. So now we multiply the probability with the amount won in both cases, and we get 5 and minus 0.5, right? 10 times 1/2 is 5, and minus 1 times 1/2 is 0.5. Then the last step to calculate the expected value is to sum up these values, and we get that the sum is 4.5. So notice that this is a positive value, and it's higher than 0. And so this kind of formalizes the intuition that this is a much better bet. You expect to make around $4.50 with this bet if we take it 10 times. And actually, it doesn't matter how many times you take this bet. You always expect to make this amount of money, right? It's the average. So we've seen how to calculate the expected value of a gamble. So let's look at some definitions of kinds of gambles. So a fair bet is a bet where you can expect to win $0, right? In those kinds of bets, then your expected value and my expected value are going to be the same. We're both going to expect to not make money. And that's what makes it fair, right? It's not going to be fair if you or I accept with a bet where you make $10 if it lands heads and lose $1 if it lands tails, because it's skewed, it's asymmetric in a way, right? The coin is not fair, but yet the amount of money you make from it landing heads is so much bigger than the amount of money you lose if it lands tails. So a fair bet is one where you can expect to make $0. If the bet has an expected value greater than 0, then you'll say that it's favorable, at least from your perspective. If it's less than $0, then it's unfavorable. And so it's going to be a tenet of this class that generally seems reasonable to accept a wager or a bet with a positive expected gain, so a favorable bet, and reject a wager with a negative expected gain, right? It's going to be reasonable for me to accept a bet where for example, if you give me $10 if it lands heads and I give you $1 if it lands tails, right? Because it seems like the expected money I'm going to make on average taking this bet is going to be really positive. And so it's favorable for me. So it seems like I should be taking these kinds of bets. But of course, it's not the only thing that we're going to care about when taking a bet. It's not this expected value, but it's one of the major things we'll want to consider. Other things you might want to consider, which we won't touch on in this class, is, for example, how risky the bet is. For example, it could be that the bet is favorable, but you really don't want to lose, right? For example, it might be favorable for me to take a bet that if it lands heads, then I make $1 billion, but if it lands tails, I lose all my savings, right? I might not want to take that bet because if I lose those savings, then I'm really in a bad shape. So this risk averse, or how much you're willing to take risk, is going to play a role. And we're not going to touch on that in this class. We're really only going to focus on the expected value. And right here we're talking about money, but as we'll see in the next class, the expected value doesn't only have to do with money. It can do with any kind of value that you assign a number to. And the value is really going to matter. And we're going to touch on that next time and see how the expected value can correlate or help us determine whether some beliefs are better than others. Thanks for watching, and looking forward to next time.